Hello. So, thanks for joining me today, friends. Today, I wanted to talk about a Magic the Gathering format that's been around since about 1995, surprisingly, in some capacity. You know, it changes through history like a lot of things. I'm not going to get into the history of it. That's for other channels, other people, the website itself. But what I want to talk about today is a format called 7 Point Highlander, also known as Australian Highlander, not to be confused with Canadian Highlander or 10 Point Highlander, I guess you could also call it. So mainly what I'd like to discuss today is why would somebody play it, why I am interested in it, and the sorts of challenges that the format provides for deck building and construction and stuff like that. So join me today as we just sit and discuss it, talking about this cool format. So first up, I'd like to talk about why I'm interested in 7 Point Highlander. So I've bounced around to a lot of different formats over the years. I've tried different things. I've tried Pauper, I've tried building for Modern, Commander, obviously. I've also done a lot of casual building, never really much for Standard. I've done a little bit here and there for Standard, but ultimately I just can't keep up with it. It's too fast paced, it changes too often, so I'm not interested in Standard as a deck builder. For me, I'm not very interested in it. But I've tried a lot of different formats, and I'm always interested in trying something different. And I think, like I mentioned in my MTG journey video, I am very much a deck builder, but not really a good one per se. I usually have some kind of silly idea or want to see if something will work, and just try my best to build my version of it. I do net deck sometimes, but if it's, for example, if it's a deck that I want to play in Commander, let's say, and I go net deck, it usually I'll try to use just cards from my collection and supplement those cards and things like that. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Basically, I've only just recently found out about 7 Point Highlander. And I've got to say, the format intrigues me. Now, of course, a lot of people probably know about Canadian Highlander now. I want to discuss just briefly why I'm more interested in that, in 7 Point Highlander than in Canadian Highlander. So first of all, 7 Point Highlander is not as well known as Canadian Highlander. To be fair, the fine folks at Loading Ready Run have done a lot of work to get Canadian Highlander more popular and things like that by hosting streams and competitions and things to increase the awareness of it. There are other people that were playing, but as far as I know, I think they're the biggest proponent of it, and because they have such a large viewer base of dedicated Magic players, they've been able to increase their visibility of the format, through their platform, which is great. However, the same can't be said for Australian Highlander, which is kind of sad, or 7 Point Highlander. Now, you might be wondering, why are there two different names? Well, I'm going to try to refer to it as 7 Point Highlander, or 7PH is usually what it's abbreviated when you're writing it, because they've named it that in the hopes of trying to make it more accessible. For some reason, I guess they thought Australian Highlander is more niche, but yet Canadian Highlander works as a name for some reason. I don't know. But anyways, back to my reasons why I am more interested in 7 Point Highlander than Canadian Highlander. So first up, Canadian Highlander is 100 cards, so it's a lot like Commander. What that means for me as a deck builder and as a Magic collection owner is I need more cards. I need more cards to supplement my strategy. I need more cards in my collection to be able to have that strategy. And it does mean a longer deck building process. It means more decision making, not only in construction, but when you're tuning it up, making changes, things like that. And it also means, and they've said this, and by they I mean Loading Ready Run, the fine folks there. They've mentioned it where when you're building 100 cards, and you run into this in Commander, eventually you run out of cards that fit your actual strategy, and you have to start to dive into more janky things, right? Which is fine, and that gives way to pet cards and things that you want to play just because you like it, like the running gag of Hovermere. But for me, those are kind of big turnoffs. It's different when you look at something like Commander, because Commander is definitely much more of a casual format. It's not highly competitive. It's not 1v1, meaning that you can get away with playing more dumb cards because you have other opponents that your opponents can focus on and attack while you're dirtling about with your silly cards. But you're not afforded that same luxury when you're doing a 1v1 format, or typically 1v1 format, such as Canadian Highlander or 7 Point Highlander. So anyway, the biggest thing is really just the amount of cards that are required, and the amount of cards that you would need to fit a certain strategy. And so usually that means having a larger collection or a more honed collection if you have a very specific play style or deck archetype that you like to play. And as I mentioned in my MTG journey, I've recently slimmed down my collection to all singletons, and so that's why I've been looking a lot more at singleton formats, because I don't really like the idea of having to have 4 of a card, 4 fetch lands of just one type. I can just have 1 of a card, and it's all that I need. And so that's why I've been looking at Canadian Highlander versus 7 Point Highlander. Anyways, keep getting off track. And by the way, if you guys aren't already aware, all my content is pretty much mostly unscripted. It's just edited. So I tend to ramble and stuff like that, but that's kind of the fun that we're having here, is just we're chilling, we're listening, So anyway, that's, Canadian Highlander. So on the flip side, the reason that I was considering 7 Point Highlander over Canadian Highlander is it's a smaller deck size. You're looking at 60 cards and then a 15 card sideboard. Now I do know together that makes 75 cards, so really it's only 25 cards less than Canadian Highlander, but that's just in numbers, and I'll get into what I mean by that in just a second. But it's 60 cards, meaning that I can pretty much include the best of the best for a given strategy. It also makes deck construction faster, and it makes the decisions for tuning easier typically because you're dealing with a smaller subset of cards. The only other downside that I see to 7 Point Highlander is the idea of a sideboard. Now, like I had mentioned, I'm not really that strong of a deck builder. I'm still working on it, I'm getting there. I'm still in my journey of, learning to play Magic and getting better at it. But the sideboard is one of those things that is difficult to master, because you have to find out, okay, what is my deck lacking, and how can I bolster that up? Or more specifically, this deck does really bad in these matchups, so this is what I'm going to need. It almost seems like, to me, sideboarding is part you intrinsically knowing what your weaknesses are for your deck, and part lots of playtesting. So I still struggle with building a sideboard because, well, it takes a little bit more knowledge and finesse to do, a little bit more skill to put together, I think. Now, I could be wrong, but to me, that's how I view it. Now, again, this is very important to remember with this video and all my other videos. This is my experience. This is my journey. This is my reasons. And that's why I wanted to focus on a video like this, of like diving into why I chose to do 7 Point Highlander, and why I think Canadian Highlander or 7 Point Highlander might be better for some people, or better for me, is everybody has their reasons, and I really wish that more creators would explain why they're into a particular format. They just say, oh yeah, I play Canadian Highlander, and it's like, okay, why? What drew you to it? Why did you choose that over other formats, etc.? And I think to some degree, it's very important to remember that the reason some people may have chosen a particular format is because their friends are playing it. I think a lot of people would probably say that about Canadian Highlander when they're in Canada, right? Is because that's where the scene is. A lot of people are playing that in Canada, they have people around them to play it with. Whereas myself, I don't really have anybody to play pretty much any set format with. As I mentioned in my journey, I'm not a competitive player, so I don't really like to go to events very much, but there's not very many casual people willing to just play like a format like Modern or something like that. And also, I don't really have as much of the funds as entrenched players might have, or who have been able to get the cards that they've needed accrued over time and things like that. So anyway, back on track. Back to 7 Point Highlander and Canadian Highlander and what's the difference and why I chose one over the other. So I was actually talking to my friend about this very thing of, what do you think about doing Canadian Highlander versus 7 Point Highlander? And one of the things that he mentioned was the idea of a sideboard, and, with the 60 cards and stuff, is kind of like traditional Magic, right? It harkens back to what Magic was made to be and is what traditional Magic is, which is you got your 60 card deck, then you have a sideboard that you can use to make your deck better between matches, things like that. Now, I thought this was interesting. I was like, you know what, you're right. It is a lot more like regular traditional Magic. But I will say that with Canadian Highlander, the idea that it didn't have a sideboard intrigued me. It was like, ooh, I don't have to worry about making deck building decisions between matches to try to tune up my deck, right? But at the same time, I kind of feel like Canadian Highlander can have that degree of, well, my deck is just bad in these matchups because you can't sideboard. Now, I think even a deck that has sideboard options can still probably run into that issue. I mean, you can't account for literally everything, but you can kind of see my back and forth already with sideboarding versus not sideboarding. But eventually I just settled on it because sideboard is what would be considered traditional Magic. So there's also one other thing, and this is a relatively recent thing that I thought was very interesting. So obviously the points list is different, right? Canadian Highlander has 10 points, 7 Point Highlander has 7 points. Really it comes down to, I think what it is the points aren't the same. Like if you look at a Mox points value in 7 Point Highlander and Canadian Highlander, actually I think that might be a bad example. I think those are actually the same points. It's not usually a 1-for-1, like Ancestral Recall is not going to be the same as another one, blah, blah, blah. But what I thought was interesting is that recently, the 7 Point Highlander committee came out with actually a new rule for the points list, which is if you are running no reserve list cards in your deck, you get an additional point to play with, which I thought was very interesting, especially considering that most of the higher points 3 and up are mostly all reserve list cards. So that means your deck is mostly going to be consistent of 2 and 1 point cards, which I think is interesting. But that actually gives players the incentive to try to deck build without these reserve list cards. And I think that's pretty fascinating, especially since pretty much almost all the reserve list cards are the ones that are over $100. So that was another point in 7 Point Highlander's favor. But ultimately, I think it just came down to the fact that it's less time in deck construction, it's less cards required, which is better for my collection and me having to buy cards, So all in all, I think that's why I went with 7 Point Highlander. So I've been building decks recently for 7 Point Highlander. Now the problem is just getting players to play. So yeah, those pretty much are my reasons. I don't know if that made sense or if I was able to properly convey my personal reasons for doing it. But hopefully with this, you can see how you would choose between the two and you can decide which one to settle on. Or at least, if anything, you can see why I chose it. Now, there's something I'd like to talk about aside from the reason that I chose it. And that comes down to gameplay and actual construction. Now, we talked a little bit about construction, but we're mostly talking about singleton and that kind of stuff. But in this next little section here, I'd like to talk about variants and why you'd want to choose a singleton format versus a traditional playset style format like standard, pauper, modern, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go into price and, having to buy multiple copies of a card because we've already talked about that and it makes sense, right? Like, why should I have to buy 4 $50 cards when I could just buy one? It kind of a little bit of a no-brainer for people who don't have that much money. But specifically, I want to talk about the variance in gameplay and the strategy required when deck building. So when you're playing a traditional playset style format, for example, in Modern, if you take a deck like Crabvine, which is a very specific self-mill, almost dredge style deck, if you were to try to take that and put that into a singleton format, you're going to have a hard time with it, because a lot of those decks rely on very niche cards. So for example, there's only one Narcomoeba. There's been a few cards that do similar effects, but nothing that just what Narcomoeba does. Or I think the other one is Prized Amalgam. Those two are basically the only two creatures that you would be able to reliably use the deck with, right? Like the deck wants you to hit multiple copies of these cards, but you can't do that in a singleton format. So instead, what you end up doing when you're deck building for a singleton format, now this is typically, instead of typically going for a very specific strategy utilizing a specific subset of cards, instead you're left trying to build for a much broader strategy. You're looking at synergy between various different cards that don't share any one particular subset of rules. So, because you can't have 4 Narcomoebas and 4 Prize Amalgams equaling 8 possible cards that can enter from your graveyard directly into play when they're milled. If you were to play a singleton format, you're only looking at 2. You'd have to find 6 others that are similar, and usually it's going to be worse. Now, there are some strategies that you can replace those, what would usually be a 4-ofs, with things that are similar. So something like goblins. There's been so many goblins, there's been so many cards printed for goblins that you could easily just be like, okay, well, instead of 4 Rabble Masters, I'm just gonna choose these other guys that do somewhat similar things, or even better yet, even if they do nothing similar, goblins just have good values, so I'm just going to put more value goblins in there. And that's typically what you end up doing when you're building for a singleton format, is you're focusing more on individual card value that work with broader strategies and synergies. So because of this, I think actually doing a singleton format can make you a much better deck builder. And that's kind of what I've been exploring by trying to do more building for 7 Point Highlander, and why I'd like to tackle it more is because I think it challenges me as a deck builder to, instead of like very specific strategies like Infect, to instead something like Aristocrats that has a lot of different cards that can feed into that archetype because it's broad reaching and all that stuff. But anyways, that's why I think I want to do more 7 Point Highlander, and why you might see some more content regarding that format here on this channel, and why you might want to consider taking up a singleton format as well. It doesn't have to be 7 Point Highlander, but I think singleton formats are very good for people who maybe are good at deck building for playset style formats, but would like the challenge of becoming just better deck builders all around. So anyways, I think that's about all I wanted to say about 7 Point Highlander. We discussed briefly why I chose it and why you might want to choose either 7 Point Highlander or, another format, and why I plan on building more decks for 7 Point Highlander. So anyways, that about does it for this video. In a later video, I'd definitely like to discuss some of my strategies for building decks, and some interesting little tricks that I've picked up and that I like to do to get like a broad base for a deck, and then how you can go about tweaking it and making it better. And but you start off with just a good, an interesting base that allows you to see if that archetype is working and stuff, and how to go developing it and making it better. But that's for a later video. As for right now, hope you all just have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining me. Ta-ta for now.